Good morning, everyone, and welcome. I'm Bob Scott, partner at LCP and scheme actuary to a number of UK pension schemes. In today's world, pension scheme trustees need to be prepared to deal with weakening employer covenants, valuations during times of economic uncertainty, and corporate restructurings. In today's webinar, we'll take you through a case study that highlights these issues and sets out the sort of steps that trustees should be thinking of when faced with such challenges. I'm going to hand over to Alice and Richard now to introduce themselves, and then Helen will set the scene for our case study.
Thanks, Bob. I'm Richard Pett, one of the 8 partners leading the pensions team at Burgess Salmon. Over the years, I've advised trustees in a number of schemes in a distress scenario. Some of those have gone into the Pension Protection Fund, either through an uncontrolled insolvency of the employer or as part of a deal between the parties. Trustees of some of those schemes have supported the pensions regulator as it's gone through the lengthy process of using its moral hazard powers to protect members. But in some cases, there's been an unequivocally positive outcome. The steps taken by the trustees and the employer together have allowed the employer to return to positive position, profitability, and the scheme still being supported by the same employer 10 years later. Although all of those cases have been really interesting to work on, they're not the most important part of what I do. That's taking the lessons learned from those more extreme cases so that I can help trustees and employers of ongoing schemes at the moment know what to take now to avoid ending up in exactly that kind of extreme position in the future. And that's what I'm hoping to bring into our discussion today.
Good morning, everyone. I'm Alice Honeywell, also a partner in the Burgess Salmon pensions team. I advise trustees and employers in a range of sectors, and including a number are going through valuations at the moment against a backdrop of a changing covenant, like our scenario today.
So, good morning. I'm Helen Abbott, a covenant specialist at LCP, and I advise both trustees and companies in a whole range of situations. I joined LCP earlier this year from the pensions regulator, where I led the part of the business analyst team covering supervision work, and that included looking at scheme funding valuations, one-to-one supervision, and the impact of corporate transactions. Basically everything before the regulator opens a full investigation into use of its powers. So let's get into our case study. Can we have the next slide, please? Thank you. So we have a relatively well-funded pension scheme here. Its last valuation was in 2017, at which time the trustees took independent covenant advice, and this concluded that the covenant was tended to strong. The trustees have been monitoring the covenant themselves annually since the 2017 valuation, and up until early this year, so pre-COVID-19, they had identified that the covenant seemed to be weakening slightly, but they didn't think this was material enough to take any action. They got comfortable that because they had the 2020 valuation coming up and were going to take independent covenant advice then, that there wasn't any action that needed to be taken in the short term. Also, because the trustee board included the group finance director, who had been providing informal business updates, the remaining trustees felt comfortable that they were kept well enough informed. So when COVID-19 began to impact earlier this year, the business was quite badly hit. The employer is an engineering company and has exposure to the oil sector, which can be very volatile. So in March, as soon as the pension regulator put out its COVID guidance, the company asked the trustees for a 3-month contribution deferral. The company was also taking advantage of various government support schemes, including furlough, and had agreed a relaxation of banking covenants. So the trustees were keen to support the company and agreed the 3-month deferral based on very limited information. On agreeing the contribution deferral, the trustees issued the company with an information request list so they could get a better view of the covenant, and they got in touch with their covenant advisor to get the independent review underway. I think we can take that slide down now, thank you. So the 3 months of the deferral passed, and the company came back to request an extension for another 3 months, but they still hadn't provided most of the information that the trustees had requested. So it really wasn't possible to get a view on how badly the company had been impacted. Firstly, to assess whether a continued deferral of contributions was really needed. And secondly, to look at whether the trustees should be taking steps to protect the scheme's position. Because the company is listed, the FD has started to get reluctant to share as much information as she previously had with the rest of the trustee board, as she'd become concerned about confidentiality. What's really important in situations like this is to get forward-looking financial information, such as sensitised forecasts showing how different scenarios could play out for the company, and impact its ability to support its pension scheme. Unfortunately, that's just the sort of information that businesses are most concerned about providing. Because the trustees didn't have in place an information sharing protocol with the company, they didn't have that agreement to fall back on, and the company were reluctant to put in place new processes during a period when they were so stretched dealing with the impact of COVID-19. However, with the second contribution deferral request, the trustees found themselves with more cards to play, as they could simply say no until they were provided with enough financial information to make an informed decision.
It's clear from what Helen has just said that getting financial information, in particular that forward-looking financial information, is key. The starting point for trustees should be to have an information sharing framework or protocol, as Helen has mentioned. It doesn't need to be something that's complicated, and it doesn't need to be onerous, but without a document that sets out a common understanding between employers and trustees of how that information is going to flow, it's almost inevitable that just when the trustees need that information most, it's when the flow of information from the company dries up. As you've seen in this case, here the trustees had some leverage because of the request for deferrals. But even when that isn't the case, all's not lost for trustees if you don't have an information sharing framework. You just need to get your scheme lawyer to dust off the 1996 scheme administration regulations and turn to Regulation 6. As with any piece of legislation, you can have a nice argument about exactly what it means in a particular context and how you enforce it. But I've seen a number of cases where just a formal letter from the trustees to employer setting out that there's a clear obligation in legislation that the employer must provide any information that the trustees reasonably require as a step that unblocks the logjam and gets the important information flowing to the trustees. A key point in practice, though, is that lots of information is already in the heads of the individuals sat around the trustee board. We've got the example here of our Group FD. It's extremely common to have that situation where trustees who also hold senior employee positions already know the key financial information that everyone sat around them wants to know, and in fact needs to know to carry out their job as a trustee. Most trustees will have a policy that deals with conflicts of interest and conflicts of duty when the board makes decisions, but it's getting that flow of information into the board that's really the canary in the mine for that kind of issue. So it is worth thinking in advance as a trustee board, what will we do if a trustee is put in an uncomfortable position given the information they know? Here, if the Group FD learns something that she knows the rest of the trustees will want to know, what does she do? Does the policy say that she can pick up the phone and chat the position through with an independent trustee, if there is one, or someone outside the board like an advisor? Certainly, I've carried out that role successfully on a number of occasions. A final point just though on information, as Helen mentioned in our scenario with a listed company, there are understandable reasons why companies are very cautious about sharing information and have legal restrictions on what they can share if it's not protected. And there are good reasons why all employers will keep information confidential. So it's absolutely right that trustees who do need to see that information can reassure an employer and provide protection for everyone by signing up a non-disclosure agreement, provided it's well drafted to protect the trustees.
Another point that may come out of a situation like this, where conflicts can come to a head or negotiations simply become difficult, is that a professional trustee may serve a really useful purpose, perhaps even as a temporary appointment. The right professional will have experience of comparable situations and will have a really important role in providing an independent and objective view as part of the wider trustee board, which can take some of the pressure off the employed trustees. They can help keep discussions moving and ensure advisors are providing appropriately focused and clear advice. This is often a step suggested by the employer, but sometimes it is the trustees who will want to make a proposal for an independent trustee, and we've seen that work well in practice.
Thanks, Alice and Richard. And could we have the next slide up, please? Just to look at some details of the pension scheme. And the valuation at the 30th of June is in progress. The scheme is currently funded on fairly middle-of-the-road assumptions. Investments reflect the liability profile, about 30% in growth assets, 70% in defensive. Funding of technical provisions is broadly on track. They're 95% funded under their 2017 assumptions, and the outstanding recovery plan payments would be sufficient to cover that. The Section 179 valuation shows a small surplus, about 105% funded, but they still have a substantial shortfall on buyout. Now, if the company remains in business and is able to continue to pay contributions to the scheme, then the trustees can continue to take a long-term view. However, the company has already requested deferral of contributions, and it's proving difficult to get reliable information on its future prospects. And therefore, I think it's prudent to consider protecting the scheme against downside. And at present, if the scheme were terminated with no further payments made, it looks as though members would get better benefits than PPF compensation via an insurer. Now, those investments, 30% in growth assets, an allocation to credit, less than 100% hedged, all this means that the scheme is subject to risks, that the funding position could worsen due to changes in financial conditions, asset values, and insurer pricing. And those movements could easily turn the 5% Section 179 surplus into a 5% deficit. Could we perhaps take that slide down now? And the funding position could also be impacted by members exercising options that cause a funding strain. This could include payment of transfer values, early retirement benefits, and benefit augmentations. Also, a small number of members continue to accrue benefits for future service. And if the associated contributions don't cover the additional liabilities, that will also cause a funding strain. The PPF Section 179 valuation is calculated on the basis of current PPF compensation. And as increases are awarded to pensions in payment at rates higher than the PPF would provide, as deferred pensions are revalued at rates higher than the PPF, and as members pass through their normal retirement ages, such that PPF compensation is no longer capped, the Section 179 liabilities increase. So what that means is that running the scheme on in its current form for a couple of years with no contributions from the employer risks eroding the PPF funding position. And if the scheme then terminated with no further payments made, even if it didn't end up in the PPF, the extent to which it would be possible to provide better benefits would be lower than now. Now, of course, some members will be better off in that scenario. An individual aged 64 who passes through his normal retirement age would have an effective 11% uplift applied to his PPF compensation, as the 90% cap no longer applies. A pensioner who gets an RPI-linked increase on her pre-97 pension would also be better off than under the PPF, where her pre-97 pension wouldn't increase. However, other members would be worse off, as the 5% surplus that would have been used to provide them with better benefits than PPF compensation has been eroded and effectively used to enhance other members' position. So the trustees, by not taking steps to protect the scheme's position, would effectively have been treating certain groups of members more favourably than others. So what steps can the trustees take to protect the scheme? First, they could consider de-risking the investment strategy and increasing the levels of hedging. They could carefully examine all member option terms and consider whether they should be amended or transfer values reduced for underfunding. To the extent that accrual of benefits continues, ensure that contributions are paid at an appropriate level. And assess the extent to which the value of PPF compensation is expected to increase each year, and seek to have contributions or security put in place to cover that increase. Now, the extent to which the trustees should take such steps will depend on their assessment of the ability of the employer to stand behind the scheme beyond the short term. And the extent to which they can take such steps will depend on the powers that they have under the scheme's trustee rules. And these are potentially very difficult decisions for trustees to take. Some of them will be members of the scheme. Others will be employees of the company, in some cases in senior decision-making positions. And as Alice mentioned earlier, having an independent professional trustee on the board can be very helpful in these circumstances.
That's exactly right, Bob. There can be some extremely difficult decisions for trustees to take, and it all comes back to the powers that trustees themselves have, whether it's under the scheme's trustees and rules, pensions legislation, or insolvency legislation, which trustees can use just as much as any other multi-million pound creditor of the employer can. Given the draconian powers that the pensions regulator has, it can be too easy for everyone to default to assuming that it's the regulator and its powers that are most relevant to protecting scheme members, particularly in extreme situations. Most of the regulator's powers are difficult and time-consuming to use, and it has limited staff and a limited budget with which to regulate nearly 6,000 schemes. The first and often only line of defence protecting the best interests of members are the trustees. As Bob says, the first place to look is at the power in your trust dealing rules. There are two key powers I'd think about in a situation like this. First is your contribution rule, and the second is your wind-up power. Both of those can be really useful to protect scheme members directly by getting more money into the scheme now or over time, but also by giving the trustees leverage which can be used to get a seat at the table and secure other protections like contingent assets and security for the future. So the first of those is your contribution rule. Over the past 10 to 15 years, I think it's fair to say that most schemes have run on the basis that valuations and contributions are agreed between trustees and employers, and indeed, the regulator's guidance encourages trustees, regardless of their strict legal powers, to seek to agree wherever possible. But it is worth checking, what does your power actually say? And how does it interact with the requirements of the Pensions Act? I've come across a lot of schemes where, as I say, things have been run on the basis of reaching agreement in the past, but actually when you dig into the rules, you see that the trustees have a unilateral power after only consulting with the employer to set the rate of contributions into the scheme. Clearly that's an important enough power on its own, but also it opens the door to other actions like triggering payments under guarantees and other protections. Similarly, it's really important to establish what your partial and scheme wind-up powers are. I should pause for a second and say that the power to wind up a pension scheme and almost inevitably force an employer into insolvency is well described as a nuclear option. It's not a button that any trustee in the country wants to press, but unfortunately it is one that needs to be considered, and I've been in a number of meetings where that decision has got very close to being implemented. But fortunately, most of the time, we're not talking about using the power, we're talking about getting a seat at the table and being treated seriously as a major creditor by asserting your position as that major creditor. Again, it's a case of looking at your rules and think what they really mean. It's often the case that trustees assume they don't have a wind-up power, but because of something that happened in the past, perhaps a botched closure to accrual, an action is taken that engaged in wind-up power. But also, if you look at your wind-up power and it says that trustees have a power to wind up if the scheme is insolvent, you might assume that your scheme isn't insolvent. But actually, if you apply the test, which does apply here, that insolvency is where your liabilities outstrip your assets, virtually every scheme in the country is technically insolvent, and you have that engaged power to wind up, giving you that much greater power as a creditor. So worth exploring.
Yes, it can be a really useful power if you have it, although it can feel like quite a burden of responsibility for trustees where it does apply. More broadly, a power that is universal for trustees is the investment power, and that comes with an absolute duty of care for trustees. So it is critical that trustees keep their investment strategy under review, particularly where the covenant and economic situation are changing. There is a legal obligation to consult the employer and to take their views on board, but ultimately it is the trustees' power, and if they allow a reasonable time for response in the circumstances, they can and should make changes if that is what they believe is right. Now, there is a lot of scope for negotiation on investment powers, as I'm sure you all know, and on the strategy. And we've often seen employers want to keep more risk on table than the trustees. Now, it is open to the trustees to agree to such proposals as part of a deal, perhaps with a contingent asset or contingent contributions. Generally, these will be structured so that the trustee retains the option to change the strategy, but they would lose the benefit of the promised protection if they do so. That way, they don't fetter their own powers. We've also mentioned that the scheme remains open to accrual. Often trustees think this is really an HR matter and not something for them to touch on. And whilst generally that is a rational and correct approach, in a more distressed situation, it is something the trustees need to be thinking about. And there are situations where a closure to accrual is put on the table by the trustees. Now, it would be pretty rare for trustees to have a unilateral power to close a scheme, but ultimately, if necessary, the regulator does have that power, and the trustees could ask it to exercise the power.
Thanks, Alice. Can we have the next slide, please? So through 2020, the business continued to be badly impacted by COVID. Its market cap halved, and the cash it had stockpiled from seeking easements from various stakeholders and suspending dividends is starting to get eaten into. Also, after some optimism during the summer, it's clear the second wave of COVID is underway and further stretching times are likely to be ahead. By saying that they were unwilling to agree to a further contribution deferral unless they were provided with financial information, the trustees did manage to get enough information to assess the covenant. From this, they became aware that the business was considering a financial restructuring and its lenders are involved. The trustees' covenant advisor suggested making agreement to a further 3-month contribution deferral, contingent on the scheme getting a seat at the table in the restructuring discussions. At the same time, the pensions regulator, through its environmental scanning, became aware that there was likely to be restructuring discussions, and it's contacted the trustees for further information and to find out what steps they're taking to protect scheme members. The regulator has reviewed its records on the scheme and raised a query with the trustees about flexible apportionment arrangements that took place 3 years ago. In these FAAs, the liabilities of 5 traded employers were transferred to a group service company, and a Section 75 guarantee was put in place from the listed parent. The trustees did consider the impacts of the FAAs at the time and whether the funding test was met, and they concluded it was, largely based on the ability of the parent to draw on the earnings of the whole group to support the scheme. The trustees considered that the prospect of insolvency was so remote that they shouldn't put much weight on that scenario. Whilst on an ongoing basis, the trustees' conclusions about the group being able to adequately fund the scheme is reasonable, and this is based on the parent company guarantor being able to draw on the earnings of all its subsidiaries to fund contributions to the scheme as and when they are due. On an insolvency basis, the situation is different. This is because if an insolvency occurs, creditors can usually only claim the amounts they are owed from the individual companies in which they are a creditor. So, with the FAAs, the scheme gave up 5 separate creditor claims into trading and asset holding companies in exchange for a claim into a service company with no tangible assets, and the parent company guarantor whose assets are primarily its shares and subsidiaries. The parent company will only realise value from these shares after all creditors with direct claims into those companies have been paid in full. Because lenders often have cross-guarantees across all significant group companies, it's likely that any value realised from these entities will be fully used paying their direct creditors and the lender's claim before any value flows up to the parent that is available to fund the scheme. We call this structural subordination because the way the group and financing arrangements are structured results in the scheme's claim getting effectively pushed down the pecking order. Whilst the insolvency of the group might have seemed extremely unlikely at the point the trustees were considering the FAAs, it doesn't mean that at any future point it's not a possibility. Things like FAAs are permanent changes to the covenant, and trustees should consider the potential impact of all scenarios, however unlikely they may seem in the short term. So as this year has shown, things can change very quickly. Back in January, some trustees would have been sitting comfortably with strong employer covenants, and they're now considering a very different situation, with some even concerned about the short-term viability of their employers. So I think we take the slide down now, please. So for this employer group, financial restructuring discussions are underway, and the various stakeholders are trying to preserve or even enhance their position. The group's lenders are looking to take security over the group's assets as a condition of providing additional funding. And this is a concern for the scheme as it could put it further behind the banks in terms of access to value in an insolvency scenario. Also, recent changes to insolvency legislation mean that HMRC, so tax owing, will rank before unsecured creditors, which will also reduce the scheme's return. The trustees are taking legal and covenant advice to support them, and this is really important to ensure that they're fully aware of the frameworks within which things could play out. The recent Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act has introduced new processes which could impact creditors. For example, companies could go into a moratorium process, which would mean creditors, including pension schemes, wouldn't be able to enforce their debts for a time. Also, a further new process is a court-approved restructuring plan, which could result in certain creditors having their claims reduced to ensure the survival of the company as a whole. These are new processes, so the exact way they will play out for pension schemes is uncertain at the moment. But trustees do need to be aware of them and take professional advice to ensure that any agreements they make with their employer don't have unintended consequences for the future. Also, there are temporary arrangements currently in place due to COVID-19, which could impact the options available for some creditors in the short term. So it's important that trustees don't enter into agreements without fully considering how these could impact the pension scheme, both in the short and longer term. As has been seen here with the FAAs, just because an outcome seems unlikely at one point in time, it doesn't mean it will remain so over the full period in which the scheme is reliant on the employer covenant, which is likely to be many years into the future for most schemes.
I completely echo that. It's important to think through the range of future outcomes when agreeing to something now. A particularly important point that Helen mentions is structural subordination, We've seen a number of cases where trustees have previously accepted and put a lot of reliance on a guarantee from a parent company, thinking it's the gold standard, only to realise later when looking at covenant how limited the value is on an insolvency. Almost underlining the point, I've been involved in cases where structural subordination like that has been part of the overall deal, something that trustees have conceded in order to gain another form of mitigation elsewhere. Everything really comes back to checking your documentation to make sure that you as trustees have full visibility on how everything fits together and what will happen in all scenarios, in particular the worst case scenario. Good examples of forward thinking that we've seen at the moment, picking up on Helen's point around the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act, the trustees sitting back and thinking about, well, what will happen in the case of a moratorium or a restructuring plan? Do we need information triggers to let us know those are coming, get more information flowing to us? And actually, could some of our current contingent assets, which will only trigger on a pure insolvency, could they be amended so that they trigger in relation to a moratorium or restructuring plan? It all comes back to knowing your powers, both under your deed and rules, but also, for example, if you have a guarantee from a valuable entity, when can you trigger it? If there's a missed contribution to the scheme, can you enforce under the guarantee, or do you need a full insolvency or wind up? And many schemes will have a guarantee put in place using the Pension Protection Fund standard form. It's very useful for the industry to have a standard form, but it's not always the best document to protect trustees. Bob's mentioned in this example that the scheme is around 105% funded on the PPF basis, and it's got a full Section 75 guarantee. But assuming that that guarantee was entered into on standard form, all the parent company that gave the guarantee needs to do now is dig the document out, go to Schedule 2, find the amendment and release criteria, and present a proposal to the trustees that says, we're 105% funded on PPF, we would like to release the guarantee. You go from day one, you're sitting in a nice position with a full Section 75 guarantee. To day two, the trustee is not going to do anything to stop the discharge of the guarantee. So if there's one thing I'd ask you to take away from listening to my section today, certainly would be if you have a guarantee, go and check exactly what it says. Funding positions moved since it was put.
Thanks, Richard. What else could the trustees do to help themselves be prepared, thinking about how the situation might develop? Corporate restructuring and refinancing can move very quickly, particularly in a distressed situation. Traditionally, trustee business moves along at a steadier pace, so trustees do need to be ready to shift into another gear. We've already touched on being prepared for conflicts of interest and ensuring information flow from the company. And other steps that trustees could take to prepare include having a clear protocol about who will be the main contact, who will be the subgroup of trustees that acts as the working party, making sure that everybody knows who all the advisors are if you need to go to them quickly. Consider whether any training is appropriate in preparation, for example, on how a takeover process, whether hostile or otherwise, works for a listed company, or how the insolvency and pre-insolvency processes an employer may go through might play out for the trustees. From the employer side, there can be a lot of concern about confidentiality, as we've touched on, particularly where it is listed, as in our scenario. Days or more can be saved by having general agreements covering non-disclosure of confidential information in place with individual trustees and advisors in advance. When it comes to expenses, sometimes we find that employers can make it difficult for trustees to incur expenses to take the advice they need. And whilst trustees will generally be sympathetic so far as possible to the need to manage costs at a difficult time for the employer, the reassuring point here for trustees is the absolute trust law right to take the advice needed to ensure they can act appropriately and to use scheme funds for that, even reclaiming from the employer until later if necessary. Good protocols about who signs off the expenses can be helpful. An important development for negotiations in practice may come from the Pension Schemes Bill currently before Parliament. It introduces a new concept of declarations of intent along with related notifiable events to the regulator. The detail is yet to be set out in regulations, and this could be a whole talk in its own right. But in brief, the aim is to give the regulator and the trustees more influence whilst a transaction is going on in order to better protect the security of members' benefits, rather than having to deal with it after the event. The types of transaction covered are likely to be sales of shares or businesses of sponsoring employers, and the granting of security ahead of the scheme. So you can see that they will be very relevant to the type of scenario we've been looking at.
Thanks, Alice. And it's worth considering at this stage, just how things have changed and go back to some of the actions that the trustees might have contemplated. And actually, I'm pleased to see that there's a number of questions coming in on the chat. And we'll although we're going to address them later, I just wanted to pick up one point that someone's made just here, where they've commented that it's all very well to look at this as a balance sheet situation, but what about looking at cash flow, normal cash flow, and make sure you manage that? And I think this highlights how important it is to get regular information, up-to-date information, and good information about the employer's state and what the trustee's position really is. Now, an entity priority model would show what each stakeholder might receive under an insolvency scenario prior to the restructuring, so that you can compare that to the insolvency position following the restructuring, after the banks have provided the extra finance and taken their additional security. And Richard mentioned how important the wind-up trigger is. Now, even though it's a nuclear option, if the trustees have the ability to force a wind-up and a PPF plus outcome for the members, they need to be satisfied that if they refrain from pulling that trigger, the outcome down the line, the members as a whole, not just for certain members, is likely to be better. Because in these circumstances, it's not the trustees' money that they're negotiating with, it's the members' money. It belongs to pensioners, widows, and orphans. And every time the trustees make a concession, agree to do the bit as a creditor with a seat at the table, it's not their money they're giving away. They're taking it out of the pockets of members of the scheme. So, assuming that we're not going nuclear just yet, and that things are still progressing, I think an immediate action in these changed circumstances would be to look at the investment strategy and question whether it remains appropriate to hold as much as 30% in growth assets. It doesn't seem that we're going to get much from the Topco guarantee, which means that the situation isn't as secure as we had thought. And as Alice has noted, trustees hold the investment power, and although there's a requirement to consult with the employer, that needn't delay actions unduly. And if the employer isn't cooperative, trustees can state a deadline by when they need a response and go ahead after that has expired. So I think if we could have the next slide, I'd just like to sum up before we move into general questions. And there's three key points that I wanted you to take away from today's session. And the first one is to be prepared. Make sure you have the right governance structures in place, be aware of potential conflicts of interest and how they can be managed, and make sure that you have up-to-date information. Secondly, take advice. And thirdly, be aware of your powers and when it would be appropriate to use them. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone. Lots of great practical points there. And I can see we've had quite a few questions in already, as Bob has mentioned. So if we could take the slides down now, please, and we'll answer as many as we can in the next 10 minutes or so that we've got left. So we'll start with a very topical one. Perhaps Bob and then Helen might comment on this. If a vaccine is found for COVID-19 and the world starts to return to pre-pandemic conditions, how long should trustees wait for sponsors to regenerate and start to make up necessary contributions?
Thanks, Alice. And I think this comes back to getting good information. So the trustees need to know what the position of the employer is, how realistic it is to expect them to recover and over what periods, and what the impact is on the scheme of deferring contributions, not having contributions, and so forth. And that will depend very much on the funding position of the scheme. If you had a scheme that had a substantial deficit, then to be honest, it probably doesn't matter so much if you had a scheme that has a surplus that needs to be protected. So the key to this is getting information and keeping that information up to date.
And I'd just add to that as well, trustees should be bearing in mind that where they do agree to contribution deferrals or reductions or longer recovery plans than they might feel immediately comfortable with, they should look at whether there's other security that can be provided by the employer or the wider group, for example, security over tangible assets, or potentially a guarantee if that was deemed to be of value in a potentially distressed scenario.
Right. Thanks, both. Do keep your questions coming in, everybody, but I'll pick up another one that's come in for now. Richard, perhaps you'd comment on this one, and then Helen, perhaps we could have some of your experience from the regulator. So this is protecting scheme members and being fair to the sponsor can be a very fine balance. How would the pensions regulator measure whether the trustees have taken the right action?
Thanks, Alice. There's another question from someone else who's a very good one, which almost sort of ties into the same grounds, really, which is, are trustees exposed to future complaint if they fail to use their power to wind up and then the position deteriorates and members are worse off? And in some ways, this straightforward answer to both is trustees are potentially open to criticism if in the future situation ends up with members not getting benefits in full. But what I would say, and always do say to reassure trustees, is that it is very difficult, certainly for the courts, to criticise trustees, and it should be difficult for the regulator to criticise trustees. And the best way to protect yourself is by doing all you reasonably can to follow the correct process. And it almost comes back to Bob's answer to the last question, which is about getting information. For trustees, it really is, in even making these most difficult decisions, it's all about getting back to the basics. It's about standard building blocks of trustee decision making. Get all the information you need, take advice where you need it, take account of all the relevant factors, disregard the irrelevant factors, and then the legal test is we reach a decision that's reasonable. And there's a very high bar set for proving that the decision is unreasonable, because rightly, there is no one right answer in a difficult situation where the employer potentially is on the verge of insolvency and everyone's trying to save the employer. You're trying to look at the best interests of members. There is no one right answer. So it's all about that process, and where decision making goes wrong is if the right questions aren't asked, information on financial situations isn't available. Comes back to Helen's example of the FAAs in the past. The trustees could be open to criticism for that, agreeing to that in the past in our scenario, but that's not because really the decision they took, it's because they didn't have the correct information and didn't ask the right questions. So I say it's all about relying on your advisors to make sure you're asking the right questions, and then you as trustees should be protected and reassured that you've made the right decision.
Yeah, I mean, firstly, I agree with the questioner that sometimes it is a really fine balance that needs to be struck, and that various stakeholders are seeking to strike in relation to balancing the needs of the sponsor with the needs of the pension scheme. I mean, this is certainly something that the pensions regulator has sort of wrestled with for some years, and the fact that it's different for each scheme and each employer. They can find themselves in very different circumstances, and that's why a lot of the guidance that the regulator issues is principles based. So it can be applied across a wide variety of situations. That does obviously make it more complicated to apply when there's not a set of strict rules, but I think it makes it more sort of universally applicable. So there's a number of factors that need to be considered when thinking about whether the balance is sort of in the right range here. And I think the first important one is what's happening with other stakeholders. And this ties in with pension schemes being treated fairly, and that's something that's been a big theme of the pensions regulator in recent years in annual funding statements, and it comes out in the scheme funding consultation as well. I don't think a scheme or the pensions regulator would be comfortable to see dividends continuing being paid when contributions were reduced, for example. That's quite a clear thing. Where it gets more complicated is other creditors being stretched. For example, if additional funding is needed from lenders, then probably some additional considerations are going to be thought about as well. There's also a consideration of the short-term versus long-term viability of the sponsor. A lot of sponsors at the moment will be experiencing short-term issues, but that doesn't mean they don't have a long-term viable future. So that's something trustees will need to think about and take advice on as well.
That's great, thank you. Right, a few more questions here come in. Here's one around conflicts of interest, perhaps, Richard, you pick this up. It's becoming increasingly difficult to manage trustees' conflict of interest. Do you have any additional guidance for this?
Yeah, it's a good question, and conflicts is one of those fascinating legal areas because it often just comes down to how comfortable or otherwise an individual feels. Historically, a solution has just been a move towards removing senior employees, the MD and the FD from the board, and getting independent trustees. But That doesn't solve all conflicts, and I think it's important to be aware of the detriment to a trustee board from losing those key people who know the business, know the financial position of the business. So I'd say the best cure for conflicts of interest really is again, it's information, it's being open. You have a good policy and everyone is clear on what individuals' conflicts are. You can have processes set in a whole range of processes, so you can have people involved in discussions but absent from voting. You can have subcommittees, and again, I think it's just monitoring and everyone being open that makes the board dynamic work well. And a good effective chair can really support that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. A couple of questions here for Helen, so I'll give you them both so you can answer them, although they are separate. So the first one is, I think, quite a brief one. Can the Corporate Insolvency and Governance Act that you referred to be used by a listed entity? And then the second different question is that getting access to good information is very subjective. Most employers are gambling on strategies to improve their position, and they're not always going to work. So how should trustees measure the strength of the information received?
Yeah, I'm not aware of a distinction in SEGA that means it can't be used by a listed entity, although there's very few examples of it being used as yet because it's new functions. So we'll see how that plays out in time and how often it's used by different types of companies. I have heard that it's likely to be quite expensive process to use anecdotally, so it will probably tend towards larger entities, larger groups using it. So the question about access to good information, yeah, I completely agree. It is going to be very much more challenging at current times when companies really are responding to things as they develop sort of day by day. For example, the COVID vaccination news that came out yesterday that's changed things for a lot of companies, and we saw some pretty dramatic moves in the stock market for certain shares yesterday off the back of that. I think trustees really need to keep in regular contact with their employers, and that's been a thing that I think we've highlighted through this case study. A good open working relationship and also an information sharing protocol that defines the regularity with which information will be provided. For example, it might be even appropriate to get monthly management accounts where the employer is particularly stressed, or we had one client where they were even getting weekly cash flow forecasts. And also, I'd recommend a list of things that get reported to trustees on exception as part of the information sharing protocol. So not just, you provide monthly management information, but if sort of X, Y, Z happens, then that is reported to the trustees out of that monthly reporting cycle. For example, the loss of a major customer, either through insolvency or losing the business to a competitor, which could have a material impact on the covenant and that sort of thing.
Right.
Only thing I'd add, can I just add to that, Alice? One way to judge the strength of information received is whether the trustees are getting the same information that other people are getting. So if there were a group of lenders or a group of creditors that were getting information that wasn't being made available to the trustees, then that would be of a concern.
Yeah, completely agree with that. And just, I think, one more question to close, and Bob, another one for you. This is the fact that our case study has been based on a scheme that's well funded with a PPF surplus. I wonder how would your attitude and thoughts change if we had a significant PPF deficit?
Yeah, thanks, Alice. And I did refer briefly to that. I think if the scheme is well underwater so far as the PPF is concerned, then the impact on members of deferring contributions or stopping contributions, should the company then become insolvent, is not significant because they would end up in the PPF come what may. So I think that is a very different situation from one where you have a surplus to protect, and as that surplus gets eroded, you're effectively taking money out of members' pockets. Thanks
very much. Well, we're out of time now, so if we could display the closing slide, please. Apologies if we didn't get to your question, but do rest assured we will be in touch with an answer in the next little while if we didn't get to it today. Please also do contact any of us directly if there are any points you'd like to follow up on from today's session. We will be sending out the recording by email. I know that was a question that came up, so do share it with any colleagues who might benefit. We very much hope that the session today has been useful, and it would be incredibly helpful to us if you could answer the brief survey that will pop up when you exit the webinar, as it will help both LCP and Burgess Salmon to plan future content for these events. I am assured it will take no more than 30 seconds to complete. So thank you very much for joining us today, and goodbye.